primary changes that are required in an adaptive organization are in the mindset of its employee. Changing the culture is not sufficient, as we saw in Chapter 9. Lean management requires treating work as a system and then dealing with the batch size, cycling, and cycle time of the whole process. Thus, to achieve lasting change, the QuickBooks team had to invest in tools and platform changes that would enable the new, faster way of working. For example, one of the major stress points in the attempt to release in early alpha versions the previous year was the QuickBook is a mission critical product. Many small businesses who use it is their primary repository for critical financials data. The team was extremely wary of releasing a minimum viable product that had any risk of corrupting customer data. Therefore, even if they work in a smaller team with a smaller scope, the burden of all that risks would have made it hard to work in smaller batches. To get the batch size down, the QuickBook team had to invest in new technology. They built a virtualization system that allowed them to run multiple versions of QuickBook on a customer's computer. The second version could access all the customer's data but could not make permanent changes to it. Thus, there was no risk of the new versions corrupting the customer data by accident. This allowed them to isolate new release to allow selected real customer to test them and provide feedback. The result in year 3 were promising. The versions of QuickBook that shipped that year had significantly higher customer satisfaction rating and sold more units. If you are using QuickBooks right now, odds are you are using a version that was built in small batches, as Greg had into his fourth year with the QuickBook teams. They are exploring even more ways to drive down batch size and cycle time. As usual, there are possibilities that go beyond technical solution. For example, the annual sales cycle of box desktop software is a significant barrier to truly rapid learning, and so the team has begun experimenting with subscription-based product for the most active customers. With customers downloading update online, Intuit can release software on a more frequent basis. Soon, this program will see the QuickBook team releasing to customers quarterly. As lean startup grows, they can use adaptive techniques to develop more complex processes without giving up their core advantage speed through the build major lean feedback loop. In fact, one of the primary benefits of using techniques that are derived from lean manufacturing is that lean startup, when they grow up, when they grow up, are well positioned to develop operational excellence based on lean principles. They already know how to operate with disciplines, develop processes that are tailor made to their situation, and use lean techniques such as the 5 whys and small batches. As a successful startup makes the transition to a established company, it will be well poised to develop the kind of culture of discipline execution that characteristic the world's best firms such as Toyota. However, successfully growing into established company is not the end of the story. A startup work is never done because, as was discussed in chapter 2, even established companies must struggle to find new source of growth through disruptive innovation. This imperative is coming earlier in companies' lives. No longer can a successful startup expect to have years after its initial public offering to bask in market leading success. Today, successful companies face immediate pressure from new competitors, fast followers, and scrappy startups. As a result, it no longer makes sense to think of a startup as going through discrete phase like the proverbial metamorphosis of a caterpillar to a butterfly. Both successful startup and established companies alike must learn to juggle multiple kinds of work at the same time, pursuing operational excellence and disruptive innovation. This requires a new kind of portfolio thinking, which is the subject of chapter 12. Chapter 12, Innovate. Conventional wisdom holds that when companies become larger, they inevitably lose the capacity for innovation, creativity, and growth. I believe this is wrong. As a startup grows, entrepreneurs can build organizations that learn how to how to balance the needs of existing customers with the challenges of finding new customers to serve, managing existing lines of business, exploring new business models all the same time. And if they are willing to change their management philosophy, I believe even large established companies can make this shift to what I call portfolio thinking. How to nurture disruptive innovation. Successful innovation teams must be structured correctly in order to succeed. Venture back and bootstrap startup naturally have some of these structure attribute as a consequences of being small independent companies. Internal startup teams require support from senior management to create these structure, internal or external. In my experience, startup teams require three structural attribute scarce but secure resources, independent authority to develop their business, and a personal stake in the outcome. Each of these requirements different from those of established company division. Keep in mind that structure is merely a prerequisite. It does not guarantee success, but getting the structure wrong can lead to almost certain failure. Scarce but secure resources. Division leaders in large established organizations are adept in at using politics to enlarge their budgets, but know that these budgets are somewhat loose. They often acquire as large as budget as possible and prepare to defend it against the incursion from other department. Politics means that they are sometimes win and sometimes lose. If a crisis emerges elsewhere in the organization, their budget might suddenly be reduced by 10%. This is not a catastrophe. Teams will have to work harder and do more with less. Most likely, the budget has some padding in anticipation of this kind of eventuality. Startups are different. Too much budget is as harmful as too little, as countless .com failures can attest, and startups are extremely sensitive to mid-course budgetary changes. It is extremely rare for a stand-alone startup company to lose 10% of its cash on hand suddenly. In a large number of cases, this would be a fatal blow, as independent startups are run with little margin for error. Thus, startups are both easier and more demanding to run than traditional division. They require much less capital overall, but that capital must be absolutely secure from tampering. Independent development authority. Startup teams need complete autonomy complete autonomy to develop and market new products within their limited mandate. They have to be able to conceive and execute experiment without having to gain an excessive numbers of approval. I strongly recommend that the startup teams be completely cross-functional. That is, have full-time representation from every functional department in the company that will be involved in the creation or launch of their early product. They have to be able to build and ship actual functioning product and services, not just prototypes. Handoff and approvals slow down the build a major lean feedback loop and inhibit both learning and accountability. Startup require that they be kept to an absolute minimum. Of course, this level of development and autonomy is liable to raise fear in a parent organization. Alleviating those fear is a major goal of the method recommended below. A personal stake in the outcome. Third, entrepreneurs need a personal stake in the outcome of their creation in standalone new ventures. This usually is achieved through stock options or other forms of equity ownership, where a bonus system must be used instead. The best incentive are tied to the long-term performance of the new innovation. However, I do not believe that a personal stake has to be financial. This is especially important in organizations such as non-profit and government, in which the innovation is not tied to financial objective. In these cases, it is still possible for teams to have a personal stake. The parent organization has to make it clear who the innovator is and make sure the innovator receives credit for having brought the new product to life. if it is successful. As one entrepreneur who ran her own division at a major media company told me, financial incentive aside, I always felt that because my name was on the door, had more to lose and more to prove than someone else. That sense of ownership is not insignificant. This formula is effective for profit companies as well. At Toyota, the manager in charge of developing a new vehicle from start to finish is called the Susha or chief engineer. Susha are often called heavyweight project manager in the US literature, but this name understates their real role as design leaders. Toyota employees translate the terms as chief engineer, and they refer to the vehicle under development as the Susha cars. They assured us that the Susha has financial absolute authority over every aspect of vehicle development. On the flip side, I know an extremely high profile technology company that has a reputation for having an innovative culture, yet its track record of producing new products is disappointing. The company boasts an internal reward system that is based on large financial and status awards to teams that do something extraordinary, but those awards are handed out by senior management on the basis of no one knows what. There are no objective criteria by which a team can gauge whether it will win this coveted lottery. Teams have little confidence that they will receive any long term ownership of their innovation. Thus, teams really are motivated to take real risks, instead, focusing their energies on projects that are expected to win the approval of senior management. Creation Creating a platform for experimentation. Next, it is important to focus on establishing the ground rules under which autonomous startup teams operate, how to protect the parent organization, how to hold entrepreneurial managers accountable, and how to reintegrate an innovation back into the parent organization if it is successfully recalled the Iceland of freedom that enables the SnapTax teams in Chapter 2 to successfully create a startup within Intuit. That's what a platform for experimentation can do. Protecting the parent organization. Conventionally, advice about internal innovator focuses on protecting the startup from the parent organization. I believe it is necessary to turn this model to its head on its head. Let me begin by describing a fairly typical meeting from one of my consulting clients. A large company senior management had gathered to make decision about what to include in the next version of its product. As part of the company commitment to being data driving, it had tried to conduct an experiment on pricing. The first part of the meeting was taking up with interrupting the data from the experiment. One problem was that nobody could agree on what the data meant. Many custom reports had been created for the meeting. The data warehouse team was at the meeting too. The more they were asked to explain the detail of each row on the spreadsheet, the more evident it became that nobody understood how those numbers had been derived. What we were left looking at was the number of gross sales of the product at a variety of different price points broken down by quarter and by customer segment. It was a lot of data to try to comprehend. Worse, nobody was sure which customer had been exposed to the experiment. Different teams had been responsible for implementing it, and so different parts of the product had been updated at a different times. The whole process had taken many months, and by this point, the pupil who had conceived the experiment had been moved to a division separate from that of the pupil who had executed it. You should be able to spot the many problems with this situation: the use of vanity metrics instead of actionable metrics, an overly long cycle time, the use of large batch size, and unclear growth hypothesis, a weak experimental design, a lack of team ownership, and therefore very little learning. Listening in, I assumed this would be the end of the meeting with no agreed on fact to help make the decision. I thought nobody would have any basis for making the case for a particular action. I was wrong. Each department simply took whatever inter- interpretation of the data supported its position best and started advocating on its own behalf. Other department would chime in with alternative interpretation that supported their position, and so on. In the end, decisions were not made based on data. Instead, the executive running the meeting was forced to base decision on the most plausible sounding argument. It seems wasteful to me how much of the meeting had been spent debating the data, because in the end the argument that carried the day could have been made right at the start. It was as if each advocate sensed that he or she was about to be ambushed. If another team managed to bring clarity to the situation, it might undermine the person, and so the rational response was to obs- obfuscate obfuscate as much as possible. What a waste. Ironically, meeting like this had given data driving decision making an experiment a bad name inside the company, and for good reason. The data warehouse team was producing reports that nobody read or understand. The project team felt the experiment were a waste of time since they involved building features halfway, which meant they were never any good. Running an experiment seemed to them to be code for postponing a hard decision. Worst of all, the executive team experienced the meeting as chronic headache. Their old product prioritization meeting might have been little more than a battle of opinion, but at least the executive understood what was going on. Now they had to go through a ritual that involved complex math and reached no definite outcomes, and then they ended up having a battle of opinions anyway. Rational fears. However, at the heart of this departmental feud was a very rational fear. This company served two customer segments, a business to business enterprise segment and a consumer segment. In the B2B segment, the company employed sales staff to sales large volumes of products to another companies, whereas the consumer segment was driven mostly by one-off purchase made by individual. The bulk of the company current revenue came from B2B sales, but growth in the segment had been slowing. Everyone agreed that there was tremendous potential for growth in the consumer segment, but so far little had materialized. Part of the cause of this lack of growth was the current pricing structure. Like many companies that sell to large enterprise, this one published a high list and then provided heavy discount to favor corporate clients who bought in bulk. Naturally, every salesperson was encouraged to make all of his or her clients feel favored. Unfortunately, the published list price was much too high for the consumer segment. The team in charge of growing the consumer segment wanted to run experiment with a lower price structure. The team in charge of the enterprise segment was nervous that this would cannibalize or otherwise dismiss its existing relationship with its customer. What if those customers discovered that individuals were getting a lower price than they were? Anyone who has been in a multi-segment business will recognize that there are many possible solutions to this problem, such as creating tiered feature sets so that different customers are able to purchase different levels of the product, as in airline seating, or even supporting different products under separate brand names. Yet the company was struggling to implement any of those solutions. Why? Out of the fear of endangering the current business. Each proposed experiment would be delayed, sabotage, and obfuscated. It's important to emphasize that this fear is well founded. Sabotage is a rational response from manager whose territory is threatened. This company is not a random tiny startup with nothing to lose. An established company has a lot to lose. If the revenue from the core business goes down, heads will roll. This is not something to be taken lightly. The danger of hiding innovation inside the black box. The imperative to innovate is unrelenting. Without the ability to experiment in a more agile manner, this company eventually would suffer the fate described in the innovator's dilemma: ever higher profit and margins year after year until the business suddenly collapses. We often frame internal innovation challenges by asking how can we protect the internal startup from the parent organization. I would like to reframe and reverse the question: how can we protect the parent organization from the startup? In my experience, people defend themselves when they feel threatened, and no innovation can flourish. It defensiveness is given free rein. In fact, this is why the common suggestions to hide the innovators teams in misguided. There are examples of one-time success using a secret skunk work or off-site innovation teams, such as the building of the original IBM PC in Boca Raton, Florida, completely separate from the mainline IBM. But these examples should serve mostly as cautionary tales because they have really led to sustainable innovation. Hiding from the parent organization can have long term negative consequences. Consider it from the point of view of the manager who have the innovation sprung on them. They are likely to feel betrayed and more than a little paranoid. After all, if something of this magnitude could be hidden, what else is waiting in the shadow? Over time, this leads to more politics as managers are incentivized to ferret out threat to their power, influence, and career. The fact that the innovation was a success is no justification for this dishonest behavior. From the point of view of established manager, the message is clear: if you are not on the inside, you are liable to be blindsided by this type of secret. It is unfair to criticize these managers for their response. The criticism should be aimed at senior executives who fail to design a supportive system in which to operate and innovate. I believe this is one reason why companies such as IBM lost their leadership position in the new market that they developed using a black box such as the PC business. They are unable to recreate and sustain the culture that lead to the innovation in the first place. Creating creating an innovation sandbox. The challenge here is to create a mechanism to empowering innovation teams out in the open. This is the path towards a sustainable culture of innovation over time as companies face repeated existential threat. My suggested solution is to create a sandbox for innovation that will contain the impact of the new innovation but not constraints in method of the startup teams. It works as follow. Number one, any team can create a true split task experiment that affect only the sandbox part of the product or service. For a multi-part product or only certain customer segment or territories for a new product. However, number two, one team must see the whole experiment through from end to end. Number three, no experiment can run longer than a specified amount of time, usually a few weeks for for simple feature experiment, longer for more disruptive innovation. Number four, no experiment can affect more than a specified number of customers, usually expressed as a percentage of the company total mainstream customer base. Number five, every experiment have to be evaluated on the basis of a single standard report of 5 to 10, no more actionable metrics. Number six, every team that work inside the sandbox and every product that is built must use the same metrics to evaluate success. Number seven, any team that creates an experiment must monitor the metrics and customer reaction, support calls, social media reaction form threads while the experiment is in progress and abort it if something catastrophic happens. At the beginning, the sandbox has to be quite small in the company above. The sandbox initially contain only the pricing page. Depending on the types of product the company makes, the size of the sandbox can be defined in different ways. For example, an online service might restrict it to certain pages or user flow, or retail operations might restrict it to certain stores or geographic areas. Companies trying to bring an entirely new product to market might build the restriction around the customer in certain segment. Unlike in a concept test or market test, customer in the sandbox are considered real and the innovation team is allowed to attempt to establish a long-term relationship with them. After all, they may be experimenting with those early adopters for a long time before their learning milestones are accomplished. Whenever possible, the innovation teams should be cross functional and have a clear teams leaders like the Toyota Susha. It should be empowered to build, market, and deploy products or features in the sandbox without peer approval. It should be required to report on the success or failure of those efforts by using standard actionable metrics and innovation accounting. This approach can work even for teams that have never before worked cross functionally. The first few changes, such as a price change, may not require great engineering effort, but they require coordination across departments. Engineering, marketing, customer services teams that work this way are more productive as long as productivity is measured by their ability to create customer value and not just stay busy. True experiments are easy to classify as successes or failures because top level metrics either move or they don't. Either way, the team learns immediately whether its assumptions about how customers will behave are correct. By using the same metrics each time, the team builds literacy about those metrics across the company because the innovation team is reporting on its progress by using the system of innovation accounting described in chapter 2 part 2. Anyone who reads those reports is getting an implicit lesson in the power of actionable metrics. This effect is extremely powerful. Even power of actionable metrics. This effect is extremely powerful. Even if someone wants to sabotage the innovation team, he or she will have to learn all about actionable metrics and learning milestone to do it. The sandbox also promotes rapid iteration when people have a chance to see a project through from end to end and the work is done in small batches and delivers a clear verdict quickly. They benefit from the power of feedback. Each time they fail to move the number, they have a real opportunity to act on their findings immediately. Thus, these teams tend to converge on optimal solution rapidly even if they start out with really bad ideas. As we saw earlier, this is the manifestation of the principles of small batches functional specialists, especially those steep in waterfall or stage gate development, have been trained to work in extremely large batches. This causes even good ideas to get bogged down by waste. By making the batch size small, the sandbox method allows team to make cheap mistake quickly and start learning. As we'll see below, these small initial experiment can demonstrate that a team has a viable new business that can be integrated back into the parent company, holding internal teams accountable. We already discussed learning milestones in detail in Chapter 7 with an internal startup team. The sequence of accountability is the same: build an ideal model of the desired disruption that is based on customer archetypes, launch a minimum viable product to establish a baseline, and then attempt to tune the engine to get it closer to the ideal. Operating in this framework, internal teams essential act as a startup as they demonstrate success. They need to become integrated into the company's overall portfolio of products and services. Cultivating the management portfolio. There are four major kinds of work that companies must manage as an internal startup grows. The entrepreneurs who created the original concept must tackle the challenge of scale as new mainstream customers are acquired and new markets are conquered. The product becomes part of the public phase of the company with important implication for PR, marketing, sales, and business development. In most cases, the product will attract competitors, copycats, fast followers, and imitators of all strips. Once the market for the new product is well established, procedures become more routine to combat the inevitable commoditization of the product in its market line extensions, incremental upgrade, and new forms of marketing are essentials in this phase. Operational excellence takes on a greater role as an important way to increase margin is to lower costs. This may require a different types of managers, one who excel in optimization, delegation control, and execution. Company stock price depends on this kind of predictable growth.